Welcome to the Unique History Channel. Tonight we'll be doing a reading from A History of Spain by Simone Burton, and we'll be reading the Umayyad Emirate. Since 661, the Umayyad Caliphate had enjoyed supreme authority over the entire Islamic world. However, this supremacy was soon to be challenged by those who believed the Caliphate rightly belonged to the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and who resented the domination of ethnic Arabs in the Umayyad state. In 750, the Umayyads and their Syrian supporters were overthrown in a rival dynasty, the Abbasids, who in 762 moved the center of the Islamic Empire from Damascus to Baghdad. In an attempt to reinforce the authority of his dynasty, the first Abbasid Caliph, Al-Shahaf, conducted a brutal political purge of his enemies, in course which the most of the leading members of the Umayyad ruling family were executed. Among a few to survive the bloodbath was the grandson of the former Caliph Hisham Al-Rahman, who took refuge in Maghreb and then crossed to Al-Andalus in 755. Thanks to his ability to attract support among the Yemenis and other ethnic groups, al-Rahman seized Cordoba and refused alliance to the Abbasids and proclaimed himself emir or prince of the independent Al-Andalus in July 756. On his power base in the Guadalquivir Valley, Abdul-Rahman I gradually extended his authority over southern and central districts of the peninsula. However, Umayyad pretensions to rule throughout Al-Andalus were fiercely resisted, and Abdul-Rahman had to face numerous challenges to his power, some of them orchestrated by agents of the Abbasid Caliphate. The emir and his successors were particularly difficult in imposing their writ over the largely autonomous frontier territories collectively known as the Thagr, or the front teeth of Al-Andalus, the lower march based on Merida, and the middle march whose center was Toledo, and the upper march in the Ebro Valley whose capital was Zaragoza. These regions of power lay chiefly with the Berber tribes, prominent with local Arab families, and with Walda notables of Visigothic descent. Not only was the friction and conflict between these ethnic groups commonplace, but all of them vigorously resisted any attempt by the Umayyads to bend them to their will. In this way, inter-ethnic rivalries and tribal divisions helped fuel intense spirit of local autonomy, which had been such a feature of peninsular society since the end of the Roman Empire. A strong, charismatic emir might temporarily override a local separation of this sort by subtle diplomacy and force of arms, but Andalusi society remained remarkably facile. The reign of Abdul-Rahman's grandson Al-Hakam I was particularly troubled in this regard. There were rebellions in Zaragoza, Toledo, Merida, and the emir had to face two serious challenges to rule in Cordoba itself, a conspiracy hatched by the leading members of the local Arab elite, which diffused in 805. The majority of the uprising in the southern suburb of the city, which had suppressed the considerable brutality in 818. The long reign of Al-Hakam's son, Al-Rahman II, saw the Umayyad Emirate begin to consolidate its grip on power. The increased financial solvency of the Umayyad state, made possible by sufficiencies in tax collection, allowed the emir to expand the bodyguard of mercenaries, of whom were Sakaliba, slaves of Slavonic or northern European origin, which had first been established by Al-Hakam I to fund a state bureaucracy. The latter, under the overall responsibility of the Hajib, or the chief minister, was subdivided in departments of finance, justice, foreign relations, and administration of the marches, each under the control of wazir or vizier. The court was closely modeled to that of the Abbasid caliphates of Baghdad, and the emir himself became increasingly remote and inaccessible figure. On the political front, the emir demonstrated his readiness to defend the frontiers of Al-Andalus. The Christian principalities of the north were subjected to a number of attacks, and a Viking raiding party which sacked Seville in 844 was repelled. al-Rahman's reign also witnessed a more determined effort by the emirate to assert its authority over the quasi-autonomous marcher territories. Governors and garrisons loyal to the Umayyad regime were installed in Merida, Toledo, and Zaragoza, but the hinterland of these cities remained firmly under control of local chiefs. In the upper march, for example, the Murwahad Banu Qazi had established the close ties with the Christian kingdom of Pampeluna, remained in effect in the Ebro Valley and under its leader, self-styled Third King of Spain, Musa b. Musa. The fragile nature of the Umayyad control over the provinces was geographically demonstrated during the second half of the 9th century. In the Middle March, Toledans repeatedly repeated the authority of the Emir, Muhammad I, and after his accession to the throne, remained largely independent of the Umayyad control until the 10th century. In the Upper March, Banu Qazi continued to alternate between rebellion and submission until they were displaced from power by a rival family, the Tubiids, in 907. And in the Lower March, the Maluid Ibn Marahan rebelled against the Emir in 868, and again in 874 and 875. With the assistance of King Alfonso III of Asturias, established an autonomous principality based upon the newly found settlement of Badajoz, which was to remain under the control of Ibn Marwan's family until 930. By the far most serious threat to the Umayyad authority, however, was the rebellion led by another renegade, Mulahad, Umar ibn Hafsan, who was able to maintain an independent principality based on his stronghold at Babastaro near Magala, under the noses of the emirs of Cordoba, between 881 and his death in 917. During the reign of Emir Abdul, centralized Umayyad power began to evaporate, and much of the Al-Andalus local potencies raised themselves up as semi-independent princes and began to fortify their resistance, levy taxation, and raise private armies. Inter-ethnic disputes between Arabs, Berbers, and Mulads flared up in numerous places, and the increasingly dangerous Abu Hafsan, whose authority was now recognized by the Walahad element across much of southern Iberia, raided the area around Cordoba itself in 891. The emergence of an Islamic society in Al-Andalus was a slow and uneven process. The Berber and Arab soldiers who carried out the conquest began the process of land distribution among their ranks, consisting only a very small minority of the population as a peninsula as a whole. The majority Christian population and the Jews were regarded as by Islamic law as dhimmis or peoples of the book, and therefore were granted free practice of their faith. In return, dhimmis paid an annual tax, a jizya, to the Muslim authorities, and curbs were also placed on church building and on intrusive religious practices such as processions, chanting, bell ringing, although those do not have appeared to be strictly enforced. Although subordinate position of dhimmis in Islamic society meant that theoretically they were not to wield authority over Muslims, in practice a number of Christians and Jews pursued careers in the Cordoban bureaucracy such as secretaries, translators, and tax collectors. Yet while no attempt was made to impose Islam upon the conquered, the incentives to convert were not inconsiderable. Muwahadas were able to integrate themselves more into Muslim society, and the opportunities for the acquisition of wealth and power were considerably greater, and the burden of taxation was appreciably lighter. Thus, Gomez B. Antonian reported to have converted to Islam in the early reign of Muhammad I because he wished to become the chief secretary of the emir, post which dhimmis had been hitherto excluded. The rate of conversion to Islam is impossible to gauge with accuracy, yet when the Arab geographer Ibn Hakwalal visited the peninsula in 948, he observed that Christians still formed the majority of the rural population. Even if they did not embrace Islam, the Christian communities of Al-Andalus became increasingly Arabized, in language as well as custom. As a result, they are known as Mozart Arabs. The word derives from Arabic mustarib, meaning Arabized, although the term does not have to be appeared by the Andalusi Muslims themselves. Cultural assimilation, together with the possible rise in rate conversion of Islam in the middle of the 9th century, caused considerable disquiet in some Christian quarters. Writing in 854, Paulus Alavers of Cordoba lamented the fact that Christian youth seemed to display far more enthusiasm for the language and learning of the Muslims than they did their own Latin traditions. Discontent may have furthered fueled the fact that fiscal burden on the Muslim Arabic community had increased remarkably in the preceding decades. Some disenchanted Muslim Arabs responded to the progressive Islamization of Al-Andalus by emigrating to the Christian principalities of the north. Another more radical group of Christians, most of them drawn from the handful of monasteries around Cordoba, deliberately courted martyrdom at the hand of Islamic authorities by publicly denouncing Islam and by encouraging muwahads to apostate, both of which were punishable by death in Islamic law. Between 851 and 859, the leader of the moment, Bishop Egalius of Toledo, was executed, and some 48 Christians, most of them monks and clerics, were put to death. However, the Martyrdom Movement, with its emphasis on confrontation and self-sacrifice, did not command widespread support among the Christian eschatological hierarchy of the wider Mozarabic community, and after Egalius' execution, it was subsided.